Welcome back. Thank you for watching this interesting story. Let's quickly delve into part 3. Collins reached her in seconds, pulling her to her feet. "We're leaving," he barked, his flashlight aimed at the figure. But it was gone. The clearing fell silent, the air thick with tension. The other rangers rushed over, their voices low and urgent. Collins held Lily close, his expression grim. "What did you see?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "It looked like her," Lily whispered, her voice trembling. "But it wasn't her. It wasn't human." Collins didn't respond. He glanced at the tree, its dark branches stretching toward the sky like skeletal arms. The carvings seemed to glow faintly, their lines twisting and shifting as though alive. "Everyone back to camp," he ordered. "Now?" The group retreated, their flashlights sweeping the forest as they moved. Lily clung to Julia, her mind racing with fear and confusion. She had wanted so desperately to find Cassie, but now she wasn't sure what she had seen. The forest felt alive, its shadows closing in around them. As they reached the edge of the clearing, Lily turned back one last time. The tree stood silent and still, its dark presence a stark reminder of what they were up against. And from somewhere deep within the forest, the voice returned, soft and mournful. "Cassie!" Back at the campsite, the tension was unbearable. The rangers and counselors gathered around the fire, their faces drawn and pale, as they exchanged hushed words. The girls sat in their tents, whispering nervously, their fear spreading like wildfire. The events in the forest had shaken everyone, and now even the bravest among them felt the weight of an invisible threat pressing down. Lily sat apart from the group, her knees pulled to her chest and her head buried in her arms. She couldn't stop replaying the moment in her mind, Cassie's yellow jacket, the hollow, lifeless face that had turned toward her. The way it smiled, she shuddered, wrapping her arms tighter around herself. Julia approached cautiously, sitting down beside her. "Lily," she said softly, her voice trembling, "are you okay?" Lily shook her head. "It looked like her," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It looked just like her, but it wasn't." Julia placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Whatever it was, it's not your fault. You were trying to help her." Lily lifted her head, her eyes red and filled with tears. "What if it is Cassie? What if she's trapped out there? What if—" She broke off, unable to finish the thought. Julia didn't respond. She didn't have the answers Lily needed, and the fear in her own heart made it hard to offer reassurance. Ranger Collins stood at the edge of the campsite, speaking quietly with the other rangers. His voice was steady, but his expression was grim. "We're not dealing with an ordinary missing persons case," he said. "Whatever's out there, it's not natural." One of the rangers, a grizzled man named Decker, frowned. "You're saying you believe the stories? About the voices? The tree?" Collins hesitated. He didn't want to admit it, but the evidence was mounting. The strange symbols, the carved names, the figure Lily had seen, it all pointed to something beyond explanation. "I don't know what I believe," he said finally, "but we can't ignore what we've seen." Decker shook his head. "This place has a history," he said, his voice low. "Disappearances, strange sightings, people hearing voices that lure them off the trails. Locals call it the Wailing Woods for a reason." The other rangers exchanged uneasy glances. They had all heard the stories before, whispers of ghostly lights, figures that mimicked loved ones, and a cursed tree that trapped the souls of the lost. None of them had believed it until now. As the counselors tried to keep the girls calm, Lily approached the rangers, her steps hesitant but determined. "I need to know more about the forest," she said, her voice firm despite the tremble in it. "About the stories, the tree, the voices." Collins looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You don't need to worry about that," he said. "Let us handle it." But Lily shook her head. "I saw something out there," she said. "I need to understand what's happening. If there's any chance of finding Cassie and Mrs. Lacey, I need to know." Collins sighed, exchanging a glance with Decker. Finally, he nodded. "Fine," he said, "but you need to understand, this isn't going to make you feel better." They led her to the ranger station, a small, portable structure near the edge of the camp. Inside, Collins opened a file cabinet and pulled out an old folder, its edges worn and yellowed. He set it on the table and flipped it open, revealing a collection of handwritten notes, newspaper clippings, and faded photographs. "This is everything we have on Blackwood Forest," he said. "It's not much, but it paints a picture." Lily leaned over the table, her eyes scanning the contents. The articles detailed decades of strange occurrences, campers who had vanished without a trace, hikers who claimed to hear voices calling their names, and sightings of shadowy figures. One report mentioned the Whispering Tree, describing it as an ancient landmark shrouded in superstition. "The tree," Lily said, pointing to the article. "What do people say about it?" Collins hesitated. "They say it's cursed," he said, "that it marks the place where people disappear. Some think it's a gateway, others say it traps their souls. No one knows for sure." Lily's stomach turned as she read the names of those who had gone missing in the forest. Many of them were etched into the tree's bark, just as she had seen. "Is there a way to stop it?" she asked. "To bring them back?" Decker shook his head. "If there is, no one's figured out," he said. "Most people who get too close to that tree don't come back." Lily felt a surge of anger and determination. "Cassie isn't going to be one of them," she said, her voice fierce. "We have to do something." Collins placed a hand on her shoulder. "We will," he said, "but we have to be smart about this. Whatever's out there, it's dangerous, and it's not something we understand." As the group pored over the documents, a chilling realization settled over Lily. The forest wasn't just a place. It was alive, aware, and it didn't want to let them leave. From somewhere outside, the wind picked up, carrying a faint, familiar sound. "Cassie!" The voice sent a shiver down Lily's spine. She clenched her fists, her resolve hardening. "We're going back," she said, "and this time we're bringing them home." The ranger station buzzed with a tense energy as Collins, Decker, and Lily pored over the documents spread across the table. The flickering overhead light cast uneven shadows, adding to the unsettling atmosphere. The stories of the forest seemed to come alive in Lily's mind. The whispering tree, the voices calling people into the darkness, and the countless names etched into the bark. It was all too much to ignore. Collins tapped a faded map of Blackwood Forest, his finger circling an area marked with red ink. "This is the clearing Lily described," he said. "It's been mentioned in previous reports, always tied to strange disappearances. The Whispering Tree seems to be at the center of it." Decker frowned, crossing his arms. "And you want to go back there? After what we saw?" "We don't have a choice," Collins replied firmly. "If Cassie and Mrs. Lacey are anywhere, it's near that tree." Lily stared at the map, her hands trembling. The image of the tree loomed in her mind, its dark bark and twisted branches burned into her memory. "What about the other markings?" she asked. "The symbols carved into the tree, what do they mean?" Collins glanced at the file, pulling out a blurry photograph of the tree's bark. The carvings were faint but unmistakable, their swirling patterns both intricate and chaotic. "No one knows for sure," he admitted. "Some say they're ancient, tied to the forest's history. Others think they're warnings. Or invitations," Decker muttered darkly. Lily shivered, her resolve hardening. "Whatever they are, we need to go back," she said. "Cassie's name was on that tree. Mrs. Lacey's too. They're connected to it somehow?" Collins nodded. "We'll go at first light," he said. "But this time, we're bringing more equipment. Radios, flares, thermal imaging, everything we've got. If something's out there, we're going to find it." The hours leading up to dawn were agonizingly slow. Lily sat by the campfire, her mind racing with questions and fears. She clutched Mrs. Lacey's whistle tightly, its weight a small comfort against the unknown. The other girls had fallen into an uneasy sleep, their murmurs and restless movements reflecting the tension that hung over the camp. Julia joined her by the fire, handing her a mug of tea. "You should try to rest," she said gently. "Tomorrow's going to be hard." Lily shook her head. "I can't," she said. "Not while they're still out there." Julia sighed, her expression a mix of sympathy and exhaustion. "I know you're scared," she said. "We all are. But you're not alone in this, Lily. We'll find them." Lily managed a small nod, though her fear remained. She gazed into the fire, the flames flickering and twisting like the shadows of the forest. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. At dawn, the group prepared to head back into the woods. Collins divided them into 2 teams, each equipped with radios and survival gear. Lily stayed close to Collins, her determination unwavering despite the fear gnawing at her. The forest was quieter than before, its stillness unnerving. The birds that usually greeted the morning were absent, leaving only the sound of footsteps and the occasional crackle of the radios. As they approached the clearing, the air grew colder, the shadows deeper. Lily felt the weight of the forest pressing down on her, as though it were trying to keep her out. When they reached the whispering tree, Lily's heart skipped a beat. The clearing was exactly as she had left it, the massive tree standing like a sentinel in the center. The carvings on its bark seemed to shimmer faintly, their patterns shifting in the dim light. Collins raised a hand, signaling the group to stop. "Spread out," he said. "Look for anything out of place." The rangers moved carefully, their flashlights scanning the ground and the surrounding trees. Lily stayed close to Julia, her eyes darting nervously between the shadows. Every rustle of leaves, every shift of the light, made her jump. It was Julia who found the first clue. Near the base of the tree, partially buried beneath a layer of leaves, was a small mud-streaked shoe. "Over here," she called, holding it up. Lily's stomach dropped. It was Cassie's shoe. She recognized it instantly, the bright pink laces a stark contrast to the dark forest floor. "She was here," Lily whispered, her voice trembling. "She's close." Collins knelt beside the tree, examining the ground. "The soil's disturbed," he said. "Something or someone was dragged this way." He pointed to a faint trail, leading deeper into the woods, its path barely visible beneath the underbrush. The group followed the trail, their movements cautious and deliberate. The air grew heavier with each step, the shadows deeper and more oppressive. Lily clutched Mrs. Lacey's whistle tightly, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The trail led to another clearing, smaller than the first but no less eerie. In the center was a makeshift shelter, constructed hastily from branches and leaves. Inside, they found more of Cassie's belongings, a torn piece of her jacket, a flashlight, and a small notebook with the cover smudged with dirt. Lily's hands shook as she picked up the notebook, flipping through its pages. The writing was messy, the words scrawled in a shaky hand. Most of it was gibberish, but one phrase stood out, repeated over and over. "Don't listen to the voices." Lily's blood ran cold. She looked up at Collins, her voice barely a whisper. "What does this mean?" Collins's jaw tightened. "It means we need to move. Now." But before they could leave, the forest came alive with sound. The wind howled, the branches creaking and groaning as though the trees were speaking to one another. And then, from somewhere deep in the shadows, the voice returned. "Cassie!" Lily froze, her heart racing. The voice was closer now, more insistent. It wasn't just calling for Cassie, it was calling for her. The voice echoed through the clearing, soft and haunting, but it carried a weight that sent a chill down Lily's spine. She froze, her grip tightening on the small notebook she had just found. Around her, the rangers stiffened, their flashlights sweeping through the dense trees as they searched for the source of the sound. "Cassie!" The voice was louder now, closer, but distorted as if it was coming from multiple directions at once. Collins motioned for the group to stay together, his voice low but firm. "No one moves alone. Stay in the light." Lily's heart pounded as she looked toward the shadows. Her mind raced with questions. Was it Cassie? Could it be Mrs. Lacey? Or was it something else entirely, something the stories had warned about but no one truly understood? "I heard it," Lily whispered, her voice trembling. "It's her. I know it's her." Collins placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her. "We don't know what it is yet," he said. "Stay focused." The group pressed forward cautiously, following the faint trail that led deeper into the woods. The air was heavy, the silence punctuated only by the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional crackle of the radios. Every step felt like a gamble, the forest closing in around them with each passing moment. As they neared another clearing, Lily felt an overwhelming sense of déjà vu. The trees here were twisted, their branches reaching toward the ground like claws. The shadows seemed darker, deeper, as though they were alive. And in the center of the clearing stood a second tree, massive and ancient, its bark blackened and scarred with the same strange symbols they had seen earlier. Collins halted, his flashlight illuminating the tree. "It's another one," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Lily stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat as she recognized the carvings. More names were etched into the bark, some faded with age, others freshly scratched. Her eyes scanned the trunk, dread pooling in her stomach as she spotted familiar names. Cassie, Claire, and then, lower on the trunk, her own name, Lily. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That's not possible." The Rangers exchanged uneasy glances, their tension palpable. Decker stepped forward, inspecting the tree with a mixture of fascination and fear. "These aren't just names," he said. "They're dates." Lily's stomach churned as she realized he was right. Beside each name was a date, some decades old, others disturbingly recent. Her name had today's date etched beside it. "What does it mean?" Julia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Collins's jaw tightened. "It's marking them. The forest is claiming them." Before anyone could respond, the wind picked up, whipping through the clearing with a force that nearly knocked them off their feet. The tree groaned, its branches swaying violently, and the symbols on its bark seemed to shimmer, glowing faintly in the dim light. "Cassie!" The voice returned, louder and more insistent, coming from all directions. Lily spun around, her flashlight darting through the trees. Her heart raced as she caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow darting between the trunks. "Cassie!" she screamed, her voice breaking. "Where are you?" The shadow stopped, hovering at the edge of the clearing. It was small, childlike, but its form was indistinct, shifting like smoke caught in a breeze. Lily's legs felt like lead as she took a hesitant step forward. "Wait!" Collins shouted, grabbing her arm. "Stay back." But Lily couldn't tear her eyes away from the shadow. It moved slowly toward the tree, its form solidifying with each step. The faint outline of a girl began to take shape, her dark hair, her yellow jacket. "Cassie!" Lily whispered, tears streaming down her face. The figure stopped at the base of the tree, its head tilted as if it were listening to something only it could hear. And then, without warning, it looked up. Its eyes were dark voids, its face pale and expressionless. Lily's blood turned to ice. "It's not her," Decker muttered, his voice filled with dread. The figure turned toward the group, its movements jerky and unnatural. The wind howled louder, and the air grew colder, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. The shadow took a step forward, and then another, its void-like eyes fixed on Lily. Collins raised his radio. "We're pulling out," he said. "Now!" But as the group began to retreat, the shadow moved faster, its form shifting and elongating as it closed the distance. Lily stumbled, her legs refusing to cooperate as fear paralyzed her. The shadow was only feet away now, its distorted features inches from hers. And then it spoke. "Help me." The voice was soft, pleading, and unmistakably Cassie's. Lily's heart wrenched as she stared into the shadow's void-like eyes. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of recognition, a faint glimmer of the friend she had been searching for. "Cassie," she whispered, reaching out a trembling hand. Collins grabbed her, pulling her back. "It's not her," he shouted. "Run!" The shadow let out a piercing wail, its form unraveling like smoke as it surged toward the group. The Rangers fired flares, the bright light illuminating the clearing and driving the shadow back. But the voice lingered, haunting and desperate. "Help me!" Lily's sobs racked her body as Collins dragged her from the clearing. The group retreated through the forest, their flashlights and flares cutting through the oppressive darkness. The voice followed them, growing fainter with each step. When they finally reached the campsite, Lily collapsed to the ground, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The others gathered around, their faces pale, and their breaths ragged. Collins knelt beside her, his expression grim. "Whatever that was," he said, his voice low, "it's not over." Lily looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. But it was her, she whispered. I know it was her. Collins didn't respond. The group fell silent, the weight of what they had seen pressing down on them like a shroud. The forest loomed in the distance, dark and impenetrable, its secrets hidden in the shadows. And from somewhere deep within, the faint echo of a voice carried on the wind. Help me! The air in the campsite was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional murmur of the wind. Lily sat huddled in a blanket near the edge of the group, staring into the flames. The shadowy figure in the clearing haunted her thoughts, its distorted face and empty eyes etched into her memory. But more than that, the voice, pleading, desperate, refused to leave her mind. It had been Cassie's voice. She was sure of it. Collins and the other rangers huddled together near the ranger station, their voices low but urgent as they debated their next move. Decker leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed, his face pale but set with determination. We can't keep going in blind, Decker said. Whatever's out there isn't playing by the rules of the natural world. Collins sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know that, he said, his tone sharp with frustration. But we don't have the luxury of walking away. There are 2 people out there who need us, and we're running out of time. Julia, who had been standing nearby, stepped forward. What if we try? Talking to it, she suggested hesitantly. The shadow, it's trying to communicate. Maybe it's not entirely hostile. Decker shook his head. That's a risk we can't take. Whatever that thing is, it's dangerous. You saw how it moved, how it came after Lily. But it spoke to me. Lily interjected, surprising everyone. She stood, clutching Mrs. Lacey's whistle in her hands. It called for help. It sounded like Cassie. I think she's trapped in there somehow. The group fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Collins finally broke the silence, his expression grim. If that's true, then we need to find a way to free her. But we need a plan. Over the next hour, the group devised a strategy. They would return to the clearing armed with flares, radios, and ropes to ensure no one got separated. Collins had brought a portable thermal imaging device, hoping to detect any signs of life in the area. Julia suggested using Mrs. Lacey's whistle to try and draw the shadow closer, banking on the connection between the missing people and the tree. It's a long shot, Collins admitted, but it's the best we've got. As they prepared, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was listening, watching their every move. She caught glimpses of movement at the edge of the camp, shadows that disappeared when she turned to look. Her skin prickled with unease. But she didn't say anything. The others were tense enough without her adding to their fears. By the time they were ready, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, golden rays through the trees. The group moved out in silence, their flashlights and equipment ready. Lily walked close to Collins, her heart pounding with each step. The clearing seemed darker than before, the twisted branches overhead forming a canopy that blocked out the fading light. The massive tree loomed in the center, its carvings glowing faintly in the dimness. Lily's name was still there alongside Cassie's and Mrs. Lacey's. She stared at it, her chest tightening. Collins raised a hand, signaling the group to stop. He motioned for Julia to take out the whistle. She hesitated, glancing at Lily, who gave her a small nod. Julia raised the whistle to her lips and blew, the sharp, piercing sound cutting through the silence. For a moment, nothing happened. The group held their breath, their flashlights trained on the tree and the surrounding woods. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, and then the voice came again. Cassie! Lily's heart leapt. The voice was clearer now, more distinct, as though it were coming from just beyond the tree. She stepped forward, but Collins grabbed her arm. Wait, he warned. Let it come to us. The voice grew louder, more insistent. Help me. A faint glow appeared in the shadows, flickering like a lantern. The group tensed, their flashlights following the light as it moved closer. The glow coalesced into a figure, small, childlike, and wearing a familiar yellow jacket. Cassie! Lily cried, breaking free of Collins's grip. Lily, no, he shouted, but it was too late. She ran toward the figure, her heart pounding with hope and fear. The shadow didn't move, its dark eyes fixed on her. "Cassie," Lily said, her voice trembling. "It's me. I'm here to help you." The figure tilted its head, its movements jerky and unnatural. "Help me," it said again, its voice soft and pleading. Lily reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the shadow's form. It felt cold, like mist. "Cassie," she whispered, tears streaming down her face, "I'm going to get you out of here." The shadow's dark eyes seemed to flicker, a faint spark of recognition in their depths. But before Lily could say anything more, the figure dissolved into the air, leaving her standing alone. The wind howled, and the carvings on the tree glowed brighter, their lines twisting and shifting. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and a low, guttural sound echoed through the clearing. "Everyone back!" Collins shouted, pulling Lily away from the tree. The shadow reappeared, larger this time, its form writhing and stretching as it surrounded the tree. The voice became a chorus, overlapping cries of "Help me" and "Cassie" and "Claire," filling the air with a haunting, deafening sound. Collins fired a flare into the air, the bright light illuminating the clearing. The shadow recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. The group retreated, their movements frantic, as the forest seemed to come alive around them. As they reached the edge of the clearing, Lily turned back, her breath hitching. For a brief moment, she saw Cassie standing at the base of the tree, her face pale, but unmistakably hers. Their eyes met, and Cassie mouthed two words, "Don't leave," and then she was gone. The group burst back into the campsite, panting and wide-eyed. Lily stumbled to a stop, her chest heaving as her mind replayed the moment she saw Cassie standing at the tree. The words Cassie had mouthed, "Don't leave," echoed in her mind, sharp and haunting. She wanted to believe it was truly her friend, but doubt gnawed at the edges of her hope. Collins and the Rangers were already regrouping, their flashlights and radios in hand as they barked orders to each other. The counselors hovered near the fire pit, their faces pale, as they tried to process what had happened. Decker broke the tense silence, his voice heavy with frustration. "That thing, whatever it is, it's toying with us. It's not Cassie. It's not anyone. It's just trying to lure us back." "But I saw her," Lily exclaimed, stepping forward. "She was standing there at the tree. It was her. She told me not to leave." Decker shook his head, his jaw tight. "It wasn't her," he said. "It's something pretending to be her." Lily's hands clenched into fists, anger and despair bubbling to the surface. "How do you know that? How do you know she's not trapped there, begging for help?" Collins raised a hand, his voice steady but firm. "Enough," he said, silencing the argument. He turned to Lily, his expression serious. "Whatever you saw, we can't rule out the possibility that it was real. But we also can't ignore the risks. That clearing isn't safe. The tree isn't safe." Lily's shoulders slumped, tears welling in her eyes. She felt Julia's hand on her shoulder, a quiet but comforting presence. "We'll figure this out," Julia said softly. "We're not giving up." As the group tried to regroup, Collins approached the portable ranger station, pulling out a satellite phone. He dialed the nearest base, his voice low as he explained the situation. "We need backup," he said. "This isn't just a search and rescue anymore. We're dealing with something we don't understand." On the other end, the voice of the ranger supervisor was skeptical, but concerned. "I'll send a team, but it'll take a few hours to reach you. Keep everyone safe until then." Collins hung up, his jaw tightening. A few hours felt like an eternity in a place like this. Lily sat near the fire, staring into the flames as Julia and a few others tried to reassure her. She barely heard them. Her thoughts were consumed by the memory of Cassie's face, the faint glimmer of recognition in her eyes. If it wasn't really Cassie, then why did it feel so real? Her gaze drifted to Mrs. Lacey's whistle, still clutched in her hand. She wondered if Mrs. Lacey had seen the same things, heard the same voices. The idea sent a shiver down her spine. Julia's voice broke through her thoughts. "Lily, get some rest," she said gently. "You've been through so much." "I can't," Lily whispered, shaking her head. "She's out there. I know she is." Julia opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, a sharp, piercing sound filled the air, the whistle. Everyone froze, their heads snapping toward Lily. She stared at the whistle in her hand, her blood running cold. She hadn't blown it. The sound came again, echoing through the camp. It was the same whistle, the same pitch, but it was coming from the forest. Collins grabbed his flashlight, his face grim. "Stay here," he ordered the group. "No one moves." But Lily was already on her feet, her heart racing. "It's Mrs. Lacey," she said. "She's alive." Collins grabbed her arm, holding her back. "You don't know that," he said firmly. "It could be another trick." Lily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "It's her. I know it." The whistle sounded again, fainter this time, as if it were moving deeper into the woods. The group exchanged uneasy glances, the fear palpable. "Decker, Julia, with me," Collins said, motioning for the two to follow. "The rest of you stay here and keep the fire going." Lily stepped forward, her voice trembling. "I'm coming with you." Collins hesitated, then nodded. "Stay close. Don't wander." The group moved cautiously into the forest, their flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. The whistle continued to sound, leading them deeper and deeper into the woods. Each blast was fainter than the last, as though it were pulling them toward something or away from safety. Why would she use the whistle? Julia whispered, her voice barely audible. Wouldn't she try shouting for help? Collins didn't answer. His grip on his flashlight tightened as his eyes scanned the shadows. The forest felt different now, heavier, as if it were closing in around them. Lily stayed close to Julia, her hands trembling as she clutched the whistle. She tried to focus on the sound, to convince herself it was truly Mrs. Lacey. But a small voice in the back of her mind whispered doubts, feeding her fear. Finally, they reached a small clearing. The whistle had stopped, leaving only the eerie silence of the forest. The group fanned out, their flashlights sweeping the area. And then, from the darkness, a voice. "Help me!" It was faint, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. Lily's heart leapt. "Mrs. Lacey," she called, stepping forward. Collins grabbed her arm, his voice sharp. "Wait!" The voice came again, clearer this time. "Help me!" A figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, stumbling toward them. It was a woman, her hair disheveled, her clothes torn. She collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. Collins rushed forward, his flashlight illuminating her face. It was Mrs. Lacey. "Claire," he said, kneeling beside her. "It's okay. We've got you." Mrs. Lacey's eyes fluttered open, her voice weak. "Cassie," she whispered. "She's still out there. You have to help her." Lily dropped to her knees beside her, tears streaming down her face. "We will," she said, her voice breaking. "We'll bring her back." But as Mrs. Lacey's eyes met Lily's, a shadow flickered behind them, stretching across the clearing. And from the depths of the forest, the voice returned, soft, mournful, and insistent. "Cassie!" The shadow loomed at the edge of the clearing, its presence suffocating. Mrs. Lacey's weakened body trembled as her eyes darted toward it, fear etched across her face. Lily clutched her hand, her heart pounding as the voice came again, louder and more insistent. "Cassie!" Collins stood, his flashlight aimed at the shadow, but the beam seemed to pass through it as if it weren't entirely there. "Everyone stay together," he ordered, his voice calm but firm. "Lacey, can you stand?" Mrs. Lacey shook her head weakly. "It's too late," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "It's taken her." "No," Lily said, her voice trembling. "We can still save her. We found you, didn't we?" Mrs. Lacey's eyes filled with tears as she looked at Lily. "I tried," she whispered. "I followed the voice, and it led me to the tree. It showed me her face, just like it showed you. But it's not her, Lily. It's the forest. It wants you to follow." The group exchanged uneasy glances. Decker tightened his grip on his flashlight, muttering under his breath, "We shouldn't be here." Collins stepped closer to Mrs. Lacey, his voice steady. "What do you mean, the forest? What's happening here?" Mrs. Lacey closed her eyes, her breathing shallow. "The tree. It's alive. It marks the lost, draws them in with the voices of people they love. But once you hear it, once you see it, you belong to it. You can't leave." The word sent a chill through the group. Julia's hands trembled as she held her flashlight, and Decker took a cautious step back, scanning the trees for movement. Lily's heart ached as she looked at Mrs. Lacey. "But you left," she said desperately. "You're here. You escaped." Mrs. Lacey shook her head slowly, tears streaming down her face. "I'm not free. It let me go, so I could bring you back. It's how it survives. It lets some go, but it keeps others. Cassie is still there." Lily felt the ground shift beneath her, her world crumbling. The forest wasn't just a place, it was a predator feeding on the hopes and fears of those who entered it. She thought of Cassie, her bright smile and endless curiosity. "We can't leave her there," she said, her voice breaking. "I won't leave her." Collins knelt beside Mrs. Lacey, his expression grim. "What do we do?" he asked. "How do we stop it?" Mrs. Lacey opened her mouth to speak, but before she could answer, the shadow surged forward, enveloping the clearing in darkness. The group scrambled, their flashlights flickering wildly as the oppressive blackness closed in around them. "Stay together," Collins shouted, his voice barely audible over the howling wind that had suddenly erupted. The shadows' form shifted, taking on the shape of dozens of figures, their faces pale and expressionless. They surrounded the group, their voices overlapping in a haunting chorus. "Cassie! Claire! Lily!" Lily clutched Mrs. Lacey's hand, her fear threatening to overwhelm her. "We have to do something," she cried. The tree loomed in her mind, its dark bark and glowing carvings calling to her. She remembered the names, the symbols, and the eerie power that seemed to radiate from it. It was the heart of the forest, the source of its power, and if she wanted to save Cassie, she would have to face it. "I'm going back," Lily said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "No." Julia grabbed her arm, her eyes wide with terror. "You can't. It's what it wants." Lily shook her head. "It wants to keep us afraid, but I'm not leaving Cassie. If I don't go back, she's gone forever." Collins turned to her, his expression torn. "If you go, you're not going alone," he said. "But we do this smart. No splitting up. No chasing shadows." Mrs. Lacey weakly grasped Lily's wrist. "The tree, it will fight back," she whispered. "But it has a weakness. The names, if you destroy them, it loses its hold." Lily's pulse quickened. The names, the carvings on the tree. She had seen them glow, felt their pull. They weren't just markings. They were anchors binding the forest's victims to its will. "How do we destroy them?" she asked urgently. Mrs. Lacey's breathing grew shallower, her strength fading. "Fire," she said faintly. "Only fire can break the curse." Collins nodded, his jaw set. "We'll need flares, torches, anything we can use to burn it." The shadow pressed closer, its form shifting and writhing as it encircled the group. The voices grew louder, their pleas turning to shrieks. Lily's resolve hardened as she looked at the faces of her friends and the people who had risked their lives for Cassie. "We end this," she said. Collins nodded. "Let's move." The group rallied, gathering their gear as the shadow's whispers followed them into the forest. Lily held Mrs. Lacey's whistle tightly in one hand, the other clutching a torch Collins had given her. The tree's presence grew stronger with every step, its pull undeniable, and as they approached the clearing, the voices rose to a deafening crescendo, the forest itself seeming to cry out in protest. "Cassie! Claire! Lily!" The battle for Cassie and their own survival was just beginning. The group moved as one, their flashlights and torches cutting through the oppressive darkness of the forest. Each step toward the clearing felt heavier, the air thick with an unnatural tension. The voices grew louder, overlapping in a cacophony that sent chills down their spines. Lily clutched the torch tightly, her knuckles white. Mrs. Lacey's words echoed in her mind. The names, if you destroy them, it loses its hold. She wasn't sure how they would succeed, but she knew they had no other choice. Cassie's fate and their own depended on it. When they reached the clearing, the tree stood waiting, its gnarled branches stretching toward the sky like dark talons. The carvings on its bark glowed faintly, pulsating with an eerie light. The names seemed alive, shifting and twisting as though the tree itself was aware of their presence. "Spread out," Collins ordered, his voice low but commanding. "Keep the torches ready." The group moved cautiously, their flashlights and torches illuminating the clearing. Decker carried a flare gun, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Julia stayed close to Lily, her hand gripping the handle of a small hatchet. As Lily approached the tree, the glow of the carvings grew stronger, their light casting strange patterns on the ground. Her own name seemed to pulse faster, as if responding to her presence. She reached out hesitantly, her fingers brushing the bark. It was cold, unnaturally so, and the sensation sent a shiver down her spine. "What do we do?" Julia whispered, her voice trembling. "Burn it," Lily said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "We have to burn the names." Decker stepped forward, lighting a flare. The red light cast an ominous glow across the clearing, illuminating the tree's twisted form. "Stand back," he said, aiming the flare gun. Before he could fire, the tree groaned, its branches shaking violently. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and a deafening roar filled the air. Shadows erupted from the base of the tree, surging toward the group like a living wave. "Get back!" Collins shouted, raising his torch to fend off the advancing shadows. The figures took shape as they moved, their forms pale and shifting, their faces familiar. Lily's heart sank as she recognized one of them, Cassie. Her friend's face was twisted in pain, her dark eyes filled with something that wasn't entirely human. "Help me," Cassie whispered, her voice layered with others. "Lily, please." Lily's grip on the torch faltered as tears streamed down her face. "Cassie," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm here. I'm going to save you." "No." Collins grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "It's not her. Don't let it trick you." The shadow Cassie tilted its head, a faint, chilling smile spreading across its face. "You can't save me," it said, its voice shifting between Cassie's and something deeper, darker. "But you can stay with me." The shadows surged again, forcing the group to scatter. Decker fired the flare, the bright light temporarily driving the figures back. Julia swung her hatchet at the advancing darkness, her movements frantic but precise. "Lily!" Collins shouted. "The names, destroy them!" Lily turned back to the tree, her heart racing. The carvings glowed brighter now, their light pulsating like a heartbeat. She raised her torch, hesitating for only a moment before pressing it against the bark. The flames caught instantly, spreading across the surface of the tree with unnatural speed. The tree let out a piercing shriek, its branches flailing wildly as the fire consumed it. The shadows recoiled, their forms flickering and fading as the carvings burned. Lily stumbled back, her ears ringing from the sound. "Keep going," Collins shouted, throwing another torch onto the tree. Julia joined him, her hatchet striking the bark with a force fueled by desperation. The tree groaned, its movements growing more erratic as the flames climbed higher. The names carved into its surface began to fade, their glow dimming with each passing moment. But as the tree burned, the shadows fought harder, their attacks more frenzied. One of them lunged at Lily, its cold, claw-like hands reaching for her. She swung her torch instinctively, the flames driving it back. "I see her," Julia cried, pointing toward the base of the tree. Lily turned, her breath catching as she saw Cassie's form emerging from the shadows. Her friend looked fragile, her yellow jacket torn and her face streaked with tears. But her eyes were clear, filled with fear and recognition. "Lily!" Cassie screamed, her voice raw. "Help me!" Without thinking, Lily ran toward her, ignoring Collins's shouts to stay back. She reached out, grabbing Cassie's hand and pulling her away from the tree. The moment their hands touched, the shadows recoiled, retreating into the forest. The tree let out one final, deafening groan before collapsing in on itself, its burning remains crumbling to the ground. The clearing fell silent, the oppressive weight of the forest lifting. Cassie collapsed into Lily's arms, her small frame trembling. "You found me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Lily held her tightly, tears streaming down her face. "I told you I would," she said, her voice breaking. "I told you I'd bring you home." Collins and the others gathered around them, their faces a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The forest was still, the shadows gone, and the tree reduced to smoldering ashes. But as they began to make their way back to the campsite, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching, waiting. And from somewhere deep within, a faint whisper carried on the wind. "Lily!" The group trudged through the dark forest, their flashlights casting long beams of light that barely penetrated the dense canopy. The air was heavy with smoke and the faint smell of burning wood, a lingering reminder of the tree they had just destroyed. Cassie leaned heavily on Lily, her small frame trembling with exhaustion and fear. "Are you okay?" Lily asked softly, her voice filled with concern. Cassie nodded weakly, her voice barely audible. "I think so," she said. "I was so scared, Lily. I didn't think anyone would come for me." Lily tightened her grip on Cassie's hand. "You're safe now," she said. "We're going to get you home." Collins walked ahead of them, his flashlight scanning the trees. "We need to keep moving," he said, his tone brisk but steady. "The forest might not be finished with us yet." Julia glanced nervously over her shoulder, her flashlight shaking slightly in her hand. "Do you think the shadows will come back?" she asked. Collins didn't answer immediately. His jaw tightened as he scanned the surrounding woods. "Let's hope not," he said finally, "but we can't let our guard down." Decker, walking at the rear of the group, kept his flare gun ready, his eyes darting between the shifting shadows. The forest felt quieter now, but the stillness was unsettling, as though the woods were holding their breath, waiting for the right moment to strike. As they walked, Cassie began to talk, her voice hesitant but urgent. "The tree," she said, her words trembling. "It showed me things. It made me see all of you like you were lost too. It kept whispering, telling me to stay." Lily swallowed hard. "What did it want?" she asked. Cassie's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know," she said, "but it was like it wanted me to forget who I was. It kept calling my name over and over until I couldn't tell what was real anymore." The word sent a shiver through the group. Julia's face paled, and Decker muttered a curse under his breath. Collins walked faster, his expression grim. "It feeds on fear," he said. "On doubt. That's how it keeps people trapped." Cassie clutched Lily's hand tightly. "It almost had me," she whispered. "But then I heard your voice. You brought me back." Lily felt tears sting her eyes. "I'm never letting you go again," she said firmly. The campsite came into view like a beacon of hope, the faint glow of the fire cutting through the darkness. The counselors and girls rushed to meet them, their relief palpable as they saw Cassie safe and alive. "She's back," one of the girls cried, her voice breaking with emotion. Julia helped Cassie to a nearby bench, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. The other girls crowded around, their whispers filled with awe and relief. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was hope. Collins gathered the rangers and counselors near the fire pit, his voice low but urgent. "We've dealt a blow to the forest," he said, "but I don't think it's over. Whatever that thing was, it's been here a long time. It might not be gone for good." Decker frowned, crossing his arms. "So, what do we do?" he asked. "Burn the whole forest down?" Collins shook his head. "We'll report what happened, make sure this area is marked as dangerous. But for now, our priority is getting everyone home safely." Lily listened quietly, her thoughts racing. The tree was gone and Cassie was safe, but the forest still felt alive, its presence lingering in the shadows. She couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that the forest had more secrets it wasn't ready to give up. As the night wore on, the camp settled into an uneasy calm. The girls huddled in their tents, their whispers soft and fearful. The rangers and counselors took turns keeping watch, their flashlights and radios at the ready. Lily sat by the fire with Cassie, their hands clasped tightly. Cassie's eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but she refused to sleep. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Lily squeezed her hand. "I'm here," she said. "Nothing's going to happen to you. I promise." Cassie nodded, her eyes drifting closed. Lily watched her for a moment, her heart aching with relief and lingering fear. She glanced toward the forest, its dark silhouette looming against the faint glow of the fire. The shadows seemed to shift, but she couldn't tell if it was her imagination or something more. "Do you think it's really gone?" Julia asked, sitting down beside her. Lily didn't answer right away. She stared into the flames, her mind replaying everything they had been through. "I don't know," she said finally, "but if it isn't, we'll be ready." Julia nodded, though her expression remained troubled. "You were brave, Lily," she said. "You brought her back. That's what matters." Lily managed a small smile, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The forest had taken Cassie, almost claimed her forever. And while they had won this time, she couldn't shake the feeling that the forest wasn't finished with them. From somewhere deep in the woods, the faintest whisper carried on the wind. "Lily." Chapter 29. The forest stirs. The camp was unnervingly quiet as dawn approached, the flickering fire casting long shadows that danced across the clearing. The counselors and rangers sat in uneasy silence, their faces illuminated by the dying flames. Lily stayed close to Cassie, her hand never leaving her friend's. She had promised Cassie she would stay awake, but exhaustion weighed heavily on her. Collins stood at the edge of the camp, scanning the tree line with a steely gaze. He hadn't spoken much since their return, his focus entirely on keeping watch. Decker joined him, his flare gun resting on his shoulder. "You hear that?" Decker asked, his voice low. Collins shook his head. "No, that's the problem." The forest, which had been alive with whispers and creaking branches only hours earlier, was now completely silent. The usual sounds of birds and insects were absent, replaced by an oppressive stillness. It was as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. "It's too quiet," Collins said finally. "I don't like it." Decker grunted in agreement. "Think it's regrouping?" he asked. "Planning its next move?" Collins didn't answer, but the tension in his jaw spoke volumes. He turned back to the camp, his eyes meeting Lily's. She was watching him, her face pale but determined. He nodded to her, a silent acknowledgement of her bravery. Lily sat by the fire, staring into the embers as Cassie slept beside her. Her friend had finally succumbed to exhaustion, her breathing shallow but steady. Lily brushed a strand of hair from Cassie's face, relief mingling with guilt. She had saved Cassie, but the cost had been high. The forest had claimed Mrs. Lacey's strength and nearly taken Lily herself. And yet it felt like it wasn't over. Julia approached, sitting down beside her with a steaming cup of tea. "You should get some rest," she said softly. "You've been up all night." Lily shook her head. "I can't," she said. "What if it comes back? What if it tries to take her again?" Julia placed a hand on her shoulder, her expression kind but firm. "You won't do her any good if you collapse," she said. "We're all here. We'll keep watch." Lily hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Maybe just for a little while," she said. She leaned back against the log, her eyes growing heavy. As sleep began to overtake her, she heard Julia whisper, "You did good, Lily. You brought her home." But even as the words comforted her, the shadows at the edge of the camp seemed to shift, their movements too deliberate to be the wind. In the hours before dawn, the stillness of the forest was shattered by a faint sound, a low, rhythmic creaking that seemed to come from deep within the woods. The rangers snapped to attention, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Collins raised a hand, signaling for silence. The sound grew louder, closer, like the groaning of old wood bending under pressure. It was slow and deliberate, sending shivers down the spines of everyone in the camp. "What is that?" Julia whispered, clutching her flashlight tightly. Collins's face was grim. "It's the forest," he said. "It's waking up." Lily jolted awake, her heart racing as the sound reached her ears. She turned to Cassie, who was sitting up, her eyes wide with fear. "Lily," Cassie whispered, her voice trembling. "It's calling again." The groaning was joined by a new sound, the faint, mournful whisper of voices. They were soft at first, barely audible. But they grew louder with each passing moment, their tone urgent and pleading. "Lily!" "Cassie!" Lily grabbed Cassie's hand, pulling her close. "Don't listen to it," she said firmly. "It's just trying to scare us." But Cassie shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "It's not just the tree," she said. "It's everything. The whole forest? The words sent a chill through Lily. She turned to Collins, her voice steady despite the fear in her chest. "We need to leave," she said. "Now?" Collins nodded. "Agreed. Everyone pack up. We're moving out." The group moved quickly, packing their gear and dousing the fire. The Rangers took point, their flashlights and flares at the ready. Lily stayed close to Cassie, her grip on her friend's hand unyielding. The whispers grew louder as they began their retreat, the voices overlapping in a haunting cacophony. "Don't go. Stay." The forest seemed alive, its branches twisting and reaching toward the group as they passed. The air grew colder, and the ground beneath their feet felt spongy, as though the earth itself were trying to pull them in. Collins led the way, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Stay together. Don't stop for anything." But the forest wasn't letting them go so easily. Shadows darted between the trees, their forms flickering like smoke. One of the counselors let out a cry as a shadow lunged toward her, but Decker fired a flare, the bright light driving it back. "Keep moving," he shouted, reloading the flare gun. Lily's heart raced as the shadows closed in. She felt Cassie stumble beside her and tightened her grip. "We're almost there," she said, though she wasn't sure if it was true. Ahead of them, the tree line began to thin, the faint glow of the rising sun breaking through the darkness. Hope surged through the group as they pressed forward, their movements frantic but determined. "Go!" Collins shouted, ushering them toward the edge of the forest. One by one, they broke through the tree line, the open air a stark contrast to the suffocating darkness they had left behind. Lily stumbled onto the grass, pulling Cassie with her. They collapsed together, gasping for breath as the others emerged around them. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. The forest loomed behind them, its shadows still and watchful. For the first time in hours, Lily allowed herself to believe they were safe. Collins stood at the edge of the clearing, his eyes scanning the tree line. "We made it," he said, though his voice carried a note of caution. Lily looked at Cassie, her face pale but alive, and felt tears of relief streaming down her cheeks. They had escaped. They had survived. But as the group began to regroup and take stock of their injuries, Lily thought she heard something, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper carried on the breeze. "Lily?" She turned toward the forest, her stomach twisting. The shadows seemed to shift, as though the forest were watching, waiting. And she knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. The morning light painted the edge of the forest in gold and amber hues, but the group's relief was muted. They had escaped, but the weight of what they'd left behind lingered heavily. The counselors tended to the girls, checking for injuries and offering soft words of comfort. The Rangers huddled together, their faces etched with exhaustion and unease. Lily sat on the grass, her arms wrapped tightly around Cassie. Her friend had stopped trembling, but her wide eyes remained fixed on the treeline. She hadn't spoken since they'd emerged, as if the words to describe what she'd endured were lost. "It's over now," Lily whispered, stroking Cassie's hair. "We're safe." But even as she said the words, she felt a chill deep in her bones. The forest was silent, its dark canopy swaying gently in the breeze, but the stillness was unsettling. It felt like the woods were waiting, biding their time. Collins approached the group, his expression grave. He crouched beside Lily, his voice low. "How's she doing?" he asked. Lily glanced at Cassie, then back at Collins. "She's shaken," she said, "but she'll be okay." "Right." Collins hesitated before nodding. "She's out of the forest. That's what matters." Lily didn't miss the uncertainty in his tone. She shifted uncomfortably, her mind racing with questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. "What now?" she asked. "Do we just leave it? The tree, the forest?" Collins sighed, glancing back toward the woods. "We'll report what happened," he said. "Warn people to stay away. But some things can't be explained, Lily. And some things can't be fought." Lily frowned, her hands tightening around Cassie's shoulders. "But what if it takes someone else? What if it's not done?" Collins's jaw tightened. But before he could respond, Cassie finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not done," she said, her gaze locked on the treeline. It's still there. It's always there. The group fell silent, her words hanging in the air like a heavy fog. Collins exchanged a troubled look with Decker, who muttered a curse under his breath. "We should leave," Decker said, his voice gruff. "The farther we are from this place, the better." As the group packed up and prepared to leave, Lily felt a growing sense of unease. The forest seemed to watch them, its presence heavy and oppressive even from a distance. She couldn't shake the feeling that their escape had come at a price. Cassie stayed close to her, her small hand gripping Lily's tightly. "It let me go," Cassie said suddenly, her voice trembling, "but it won't stop. It wants more." Lily knelt in front of her, her heart aching. "We won't let it take anyone else," she said firmly. "You're safe now, Cassie. I promise." But Cassie's eyes filled with tears, her voice breaking. "It doesn't forget," she said. "It doesn't forgive." The convoy of ranger trucks rolled out of the clearing, the group leaving the forest behind. The girls sat quietly in the back, their exhaustion outweighing their fear. Collins drove the lead truck, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. Though his mind lingered on the forest and the horrors they had faced, Lily sat with Cassie, her arms wrapped protectively around her friend. She stared out the window, watching the trees blur past. The farther they drove, the lighter the air felt, as though they were shedding the weight of the forest with each mile. But as they crossed the final stretch of the park road, Lily thought she saw something in the rearview mirror. A shadow just at the edge of the forest, shifting and flickering like smoke. She blinked and it was gone. Days later, the group was reunited with their families, their ordeal turning into a local legend. The rangers filed their reports, marking the area as restricted and posting warnings for anyone who dared venture too close. But for those who had been there, the experience left scars deeper than any warning could convey. Lily visited Cassie often, sitting with her friend as they tried to make sense of what had happened. Cassie was quieter now, more withdrawn, but she was healing slowly but surely. They didn't talk about the forest much, but when they did, it was always with the same lingering question. Why had it let them go? One evening, as Lily lay in bed, she heard something that made her blood run cold. A faint whisper carried on the breeze through her open window. "Lily!" She bolted upright, her heart pounding. The room was dark and still, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves outside. She told herself it was nothing, just the wind. But deep down she knew better. The forest wasn't done. It never would be. And somewhere, deep within its shadows, the whispering tree waited. The end.